The moment I realized my wife was lying, I didn't feel pain. I felt the room tilt, like gravity had finally decided I didn't deserve balance anymore. I was standing in our kitchen, staring at a coffee mug I didn't recognize, still warm, sitting on the counter between my keys and my phone. It wasn't mine. It wasn't hers. And it sure as hell hadn't been there when I left for work that morning. That was the first crack, not the betrayal itself. The certainty that something had already happened long before I was allowed to know. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 42 years old. I work in infrastructure logistics. And until 3 weeks ago, I thought I understood my life. I thought I understood my marriage. I thought that after everything I'd survived, nothing could surprise me anymore. I was wrong in a way that felt deliberate, like someone had been rehearsing my collapse behind my back. Emily and I had been married for 11 years. 2 kids. A mortgage that felt heavier every year. A routine that looked stable from the outside and hollow if you stood inside it too long. We met in college. She was loud where I was quiet, impulsive where I was cautious. People said we balanced each other. I used to believe that. Now I think she just learned how to hide better. The signs didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They came dressed as excuses. Late meetings. A new interest in the gym that never showed results. Her phone turning face down on every surface like it was ashamed to look at me. When I asked, she smiled and said I was overthinking. When I pushed, she said I was projecting my stress onto her. I apologized. That's the part that still makes me sick. There was another man in our orbit. His name was Mark Reynolds. I'd known him since high school. We played football together. Our families knew each other. He stood next to me at my wedding and swore a loyalty that apparently expired when it became inconvenient. He was the kind of guy people trusted without thinking, because he laughed easy and never raised his voice. The kind of guy who knows exactly how invisible he can be. He started coming around more often. Barbecues. Game nights. Dropping by to check on things when he knew I was traveling for work. Emily said it was nice having help. She said it like she was doing me a favor. I told myself I was lucky to have a friend like that. I told myself a lot of things. The night everything shifted, I came home early without warning. A canceled flight. Bad weather. A coincidence I didn't earn. The house was quiet in a way that felt staged. No music. No TV. Just that unfamiliar mug and a second toothbrush in the upstairs bathroom, tucked behind the sink like it was trying not to be seen. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with clarity. The kind that burns. I didn't confront her. Not then. I watched. I listened. I counted. I learned the difference between what she said and what she did. I learned how long it takes for a lie to become comfortable. And when I finally checked the security feed from the old camera in the garage, the one I'd forgotten to disconnect, I saw Mark's car pulling in at 10:47 p.m. On a night, she told me, she went to bed alone. I sat in my car in the driveway and didn't go inside. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I felt something colder settle in, something patient. I understood, in that moment, that whatever came next would not be an argument. It would not be forgiveness. It would be a process. Because betrayal like this doesn't deserve noise. It deserves precision. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the driver's seat until the engine cooled and the neighborhood lights flickered off one by one, like witnesses deciding they'd seen enough. When I finally went inside, Emily was asleep on her side of the bed, facing the wall, breathing slow and steady. She looked peaceful. That was the first time I felt real anger. Not explosive, not loud. Clean. Focused. I lay next to her and stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the last year with new eyes. Every canceled plan. Every sudden fight that made no sense. Every time she accused me of being distant. I realized something then that hurt worse than the images in my head. This hadn't been a mistake. It had been a routine. Something she'd learned to fit into her day, like brushing her teeth. The next morning, she kissed me goodbye like always. Same spot on my cheek. Same smile. Same words. I watched her walk out the door and wondered how long she'd been practicing that version of herself. Wondered how many lies can live inside a person before they stop recognizing the truth. I didn't go to work. I called in sick and stayed home, walking through my own house like it belonged to someone else. I opened drawers I never touched. Checked cabinets I didn't use. Every corner felt compromised, like my life had been rented out behind my back. Around noon, Mark texted me, asked how the trip went, said we should grab a beer soon. I stared at his name on my phone until the letters blurred. The nerve of it wasn't shocking. What shocked me was how normal it felt to him. Like betrayal had become background noise. I replied with one word. Soon. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind who promises revenge. A quiet guy recommended by a coworker who'd survived a messy divorce and came out intact. I didn't tell him everything. Just enough. He listened without interrupting, then told me exactly where the lines were. What I could do. What I couldn't. Where mistakes would cost me my kids. That part mattered. More than anything. I hung up knowing one thing for sure. If I moved too fast, I'd lose. If I moved smart, I'd decide the ending. Over the next week, I became a ghost in my own life. I smiled when expected, nodded at the right moments, listened without reacting. Emily grew bolder as my silence stretched. She stopped checking her phone around me, stopped pretending she was tired. Mark's car started appearing on the street more often when I was working late. I made sure she believed I was busy. I made sure she believed I was blind. I wasn't. I started documenting everything. Times, dates, patterns. I didn't need drama. I needed proof. I needed leverage. I needed to understand how deep this went and how many people knew. The answer to that last question scared me more than the affair itself. One night, while Emily was in the shower, her phone lit up on the nightstand. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The message preview was enough. Mark's name, a heart emoji, and 4 words that told me exactly who she thought I was now. He won't suspect anything. I stepped back like the phone had burned me. That sentence did something permanent to me. It rewired the way I saw her. The woman I'd built a family with wasn't just cheating. She was confident, comfortable, certain I was already beaten. That was when I stopped thinking like a husband and started thinking like someone with nothing left to lose. 2 days later, Mark came over for dinner. Emily suggested it. Said it would be nice to catch up. I watched her set the table with care, pour wine she usually saved for guests she wanted to impress. Mark showed up smiling, clapped me on the shoulder, asked about work like he hadn't been inside my bed a dozen times already. I played my part, laughed at his jokes, told a story from college, watched them exchange looks they thought I didn't see. It was almost impressive how coordinated they were, like dancers who'd practiced the routine in secret. After dinner, Mark pulled me aside and said something that sealed his fate. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're lucky, man. You've got a good life. Don't ever take it for granted." I nodded. I even thanked him. That night, after they both went to sleep in different rooms of my house, I sat at the kitchen table alone and made a decision I couldn't undo. I wasn't going to expose them immediately. I wasn't going to confront them. I was going to let them believe they were winning. Because people make the biggest mistakes when they think the game is already over. And I was just getting started. By the 3rd week, I knew their schedule better than my own. Emily left the house every weekday at 8:10 a.m. Mark's car appeared on our street twice a week between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, always parking 2 houses down like distance meant discretion. He never stayed past noon. They were careful. Careful people always believe that makes them smart. I adjusted my life around theirs. I volunteered for projects that kept me busy. I started staying late at the office on nights I knew he'd come over. I created space so they could fill it. Every lie I told was an invitation for them to get comfortable. And they did. The first real crack in Emily's composure came when I stopped asking questions. No suspicion, no jealousy, no tension. I became agreeable, predictable, boring. I could see it unsettle her. She'd study my face like she was looking for signs of life and come up empty. That's when people slip. One evening, she mentioned Mark casually, like an afterthought. Said he was having trouble at work. Said he was stressed. I asked what kind of trouble. She shrugged and said she didn't know details. But she talked too much, gave away too many small pieces. I learned something important that night. Mark wasn't just sleeping with my wife. He was using her as an escape. And desperate men make mistakes. I started paying attention to him at work. The missed deadlines. The sudden temper. The way he drank too much at company events and talked too freely when he thought everyone around him was a friend. I listened without engaging. People love an audience that doesn't interrupt. I also learned that Mark had a problem he kept quiet. Pills. Not hard stuff. Prescription painkillers left over from an old injury he never quite healed from. He told people it was managed. He told himself it was under control. It wasn't. I didn't have to invent anything. I just had to stop pretending I didn't see it. At home, Emily started pushing boundaries. She'd stay out later, take longer showers, wear perfume she never wore for me. She wanted to feel alive. She wanted to feel chosen, and she wanted me to notice without having the courage to confess. One night, she asked me if I still loved her. The timing was almost funny. I told her yes. I told her I was just tired. I told her work was heavy. I told her everything she needed to hear to keep doing exactly what she was doing. The relief on her face was instant. She kissed me and went to bed. I stayed up and reviewed the garage footage again. Different angles, different nights. Mark coming and going like he belonged there. Like my house was a shared resource. I saved every clip, labeled every file. I wasn't angry anymore. I was methodical. Then something happened that shifted everything. Mark called me late one night. Drunk, slurring just enough to be honest. He said he needed to talk. Said he felt guilty. Said he didn't mean for things to go this far. I let him talk. I said nothing. Silence makes people confess faster than confrontation ever will. Before he hung up, he said one sentence that changed my plan. She's going to leave you, man. You should hear the way she talks about you. I sat there long after the call ended, phone still in my hand, feeling something finally break loose inside my chest. Not because of the betrayal, not even because of the disrespect, but because they weren't just stealing moments. They were rewriting my place in my own family. That's when I knew this wasn't just about exposure. This was about removal, and I had just figured out exactly where to start. Once I understood they were planning a future without me, the last traces of hesitation disappeared. I stopped seeing Emily as my wife and started seeing her as a liability. That shift was quiet, internal, but final. There's a moment when love doesn't turn into hate. It turns into calculation. That's where I landed. Calm, clear, dangerous in a way I hadn't been before. The kids became my anchor. I watched them more closely. Paid attention to routines, moods, who picked them up, who dropped them off. I made sure every teacher, every coach, every neighbor saw me as the constant. The reliable one. The parent who showed up early and stayed late. I didn't need to poison anyone against Emily. I just needed to establish gravity. At the same time, I started laying quiet groundwork at work. I took on extra responsibility, cleaned up messes no one wanted, documented everything, especially anything that crossed my desk involving Mark. He was careless. That's the thing about men who think they're winning. They stop locking doors. One afternoon, a compliance report landed in my inbox by mistake. Mark's name was all over it. Missed procedures, incomplete logs, small things on paper, career-ending things when stacked. I forwarded it to myself, archived the original, and waited. I didn't touch it again. Yet, at home, Emily became reckless. She started picking fights over nothing, accusing me of being cold, saying I wasn't present, saying she felt invisible. I let her talk until she ran out of words. When people are trying to justify themselves, they reveal more than they intend. Every accusation was a confession with the names scratched out. One night, she didn't come home. She texted at midnight and said she'd crashed at a friend's place after too much wine. She didn't say which friend. She didn't have to. I tucked the kids into bed, kissed their foreheads, and sat alone in the dark living room listening to the clock tick like it was counting down to something irreversible. She came back in the morning smelling like someone else's soap. That was the night I decided the timeline. I contacted my lawyer again, asked specific questions this time. About custody, about assets, about evidence, about what happens when one spouse abandons the home, even temporarily. He didn't judge. He just answered. And every answer tightened the path in front of me. 2 days later, I booked Emily a trip. A surprise. A spa resort out of state. 7 days. No kids. All expenses covered. I framed it as an apology. Told her I knew I'd been distant. Told her I wanted to fix things. Her reaction was immediate and intense. Relief. Excitement. Guilt buried under gratitude. She hugged me harder than she had in months. She didn't ask why the dates lined up perfectly with one of my supposed work trips. She didn't ask anything at all. The morning she left, Mark walked her to the car, right in front of the house. Broad daylight. He didn't even pretend anymore. I watched from the window as they hugged too long, whispered too close. He looked comfortable, confident, like a man already living in someone else's life. As her car disappeared down the street, something settled in me. Not sadness, not rage. Finality. I checked into a hotel across town instead of going on my trip. From there, I monitored everything. Cameras, messages, logs. Mark moved into my house the first night she was gone. Slept in my bed, ate from my fridge, used my shower. I watched it all without blinking. On the third night, I made my first call. I didn't use my name. I didn't have to. I reported suspicious activity in the neighborhood. A man sitting in his car for hours. Strange exchanges. A pattern that didn't feel right. I gave Mark's license plate number and hung up before they could ask more. I knew his car. I knew where he kept things. I knew how careless he was when he thought no one was watching. The knock came at 2:17 a.m. I wasn't there to hear it, but the cameras caught everything. Mark opening the door half asleep. The confusion. The shift in posture when he realized this wasn't a warning. This was a search. By morning, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Missed calls. Messages. Voicemails. Emily was calling from the resort. Crying. Asking what was happening. Asking where I was. Asking why the police were at the house and why Mark wasn't answering. I let it ring. Because the next part required silence. And once silence takes hold, people start destroying themselves trying to fill it. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It crept. It seeped into every corner of their lives the way smoke does after a fire, leaving damage long after the flames are gone. Emily stayed with a friend on the other side of town. I knew which one. I knew because the kids mentioned it without realizing it mattered. They asked why Mom was visiting Aunt Claire for so long. I told them adults sometimes need space to think. I didn't say who created the need. I refused to make them carry that weight. Mark went quiet. No social media. No gym. No bar nights. That kind of silence isn't peace. It's fear. Men like him don't disappear unless they're calculating or cornered. I suspected both. At work, the tone shifted. People stopped mentioning Mark's name around me. Conversations cut short when I walked into rooms. I wasn't being frozen out. I was being observed. Everyone was waiting to see how much I knew, how far this would go. I kept my head down and did my job better than ever. That's how you survive a storm without getting struck. The compliance report I'd saved resurfaced on its own schedule. An audit request. Random, on paper. Perfect, in reality. I wasn't involved. I didn't need to be. I watched from a distance as questions were asked, documents were requested, and explanations fell apart under basic scrutiny. Mark tried to act surprised. Tried to laugh it off. But the damage was already done. Trust, once cracked, doesn't seal back up. Emily tried a different tactic. She stopped crying and started blaming. Her messages shifted from apologies to accusations. She said I was cruel. She said I was manipulating the situation. She said I was punishing her instead of communicating. I read every word and felt nothing. People always confuse consequences with cruelty when they're the ones facing them. She asked to see the kids alone. I said no, not yet. Not until things were stable. She said I was using them as leverage. I reminded her that courts don't like instability, and neither do children. She went quiet after that. Reality has a way of interrupting self-pity. One afternoon, Mark showed up at my office. No warning. No appointment. Just walked in like he still belonged there. He looked different. Thinner. Eyes restless. He asked to talk privately. I agreed. I wanted to see what desperation looked like up close. He closed the door and didn't sit down. He said the police were overreacting. He said the audit was unfair. He said Emily was spiraling. He said I needed to fix this before things went too far. He said a lot of things that sounded like requests and demands tangled together. I listened. Then I told him to leave. He stepped closer, lowered his voice, said he knew what I was doing, said he knew I was behind it, said I thought I was smart, said I was playing with lives. I looked at him and felt something close to pity. I told him the truth, finally. Not all of it. Just enough. I told him I didn't have to destroy him. I told him he did that himself the moment he decided my house was his. I told him every door that was closing on him now was one he'd already unlocked and walked through willingly. He stared at me like he wanted to hit me, like he wanted to beg. He did neither. He left without another word. That night, Emily showed up unannounced. She waited until the kids were asleep. Rang the doorbell once. I opened it because hiding was no longer necessary. She looked exhausted. Not dramatic. Just worn down. The kind of tired that comes from realizing your version of the story no longer matters. She asked if we could talk. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. She said she made a mistake. Said it didn't mean anything. Said Mark was just an escape from feeling unseen. Said she never meant to hurt me. Every sentence was about intention, not action. About feelings, not choices. I told her something she didn't expect. I told her the affair wasn't the worst part. She frowned. Asked what was. I told her it was the planning, the lying, the way she built a parallel life while using me as a foundation. I told her betrayal isn't one act. It's a series of decisions made calmly, repeatedly, without remorse. She started to cry again. Real tears this time. I didn't stop her. When she asked if there was any chance of fixing us, I answered honestly. I said no. Not because I hated her. Not because I wanted revenge. But because I finally saw her clearly, and there was nothing left to negotiate. As she walked away, shoulders shaking, I felt something unfamiliar rise up. Relief. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that tells you the worst part is already behind you. What she didn't know was that everything she was losing so far was just the surface. The deeper consequences were already moving, and they didn't need my help anymore. The court date was set faster than Emily expected and slower than she deserved. That space in between became a vacuum where people start making mistakes. She tried to fill it with image control, photos with the kids from better times, long captions about growth and healing, quotes about forgiveness that sounded borrowed. Everyone does this when they realize the story isn't theirs anymore. They try to override it before the truth finishes loading. It didn't work. People weren't cruel to her. They were worse. They were polite. Polite means they already decided. Mark unraveled quietly. He stopped showing up to work altogether. Then the official notice came. Administrative leave pending investigation. He called me again after that. I didn't answer. He sent a message saying we needed to talk like adults. That made me laugh. Not out loud. Just internally. The way you do when someone finally shows you how little they understand the damage they caused. The audit expanded. What started as compliance turned into questions about procurement, about access, about patterns. It wasn't my doing anymore. Once scrutiny begins, it feeds itself. People start looking not because they want to punish, but because they don't want to be next. Emily's lawyer tried a different approach. He framed me as controlling, cold, emotionally unavailable. He suggested Emily had felt trapped, that the affair was a symptom, not a cause. Judges hear this kind of narrative every day. What they don't hear every day is silence paired with documentation. I didn't argue. I submitted records, schedules, footage, timelines, a clear picture of who stayed and who stepped out. The kids didn't testify. They didn't need to. Stability speaks louder than words. Emily saw them every other weekend under supervision at first. That broke something in her that couldn't be repaired. She tried to hold it together in front of them, smiled too hard, asked too many questions, apologized without explaining. Kids understand more than adults think. They didn't ask about Mark. That silence was louder than anything. One night, weeks after everything had started collapsing, Mark showed up at the house again. This time I was there. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, internally. He stood on the porch like a man waiting to be told where to go. He said he needed help. Said Emily had cut him off. Said he'd lost everything. Said he was thinking about doing something stupid. I told him to leave. He said I owed him. That we were friends once. That I didn't have to take it this far. I stepped closer to the door, but didn't open it. I told him the truth in the simplest way I could. I told him I didn't take anything far. I told him I stopped protecting him. I told him the life he lost wasn't stolen. It was forfeited. He stood there for a long time after that. Then he walked away without looking back. I never saw him again. The divorce finalized 3 months later. Emily didn't fight the terms in the end. She couldn't. The evidence was overwhelming, and her energy was gone. She signed quietly. No speech. No final plea. Just exhaustion. That's what consequences look like when they finish settling in. She moved out of state not long after. Took a job that paid less and demanded more. I heard it through mutual connections who spoke about her like a closed chapter. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need updates. The house felt different after that. Not empty. Clean. The kids adjusted faster than anyone expected. Kids don't need perfection. They need consistency. I gave them that. Dinners at the same time. Homework at the same table. Weekends that didn't feel like negotiations. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the man I used to be. The one who trusted without verifying. The one who believed loyalty was assumed. I didn't miss him. He didn't survive the truth. What surprised me wasn't the damage they caused. It was how little power they had once I stopped playing my assigned role. Justice didn't arrive like a hammer. It arrived like gravity. And once it took hold, there was nothing any of us could do but fall where we deserved. Life didn't snap back into place after the papers were signed. It shifted slowly, like a bone setting itself without anesthesia. There were days when the house felt too quiet and nights when my thoughts circled back to moments I hadn't questioned enough. Healing wasn't dramatic. It was repetitive. It was choosing not to check my phone. It was learning how to sit with my own silence without filling it with anger. Emily tried to resurface once. 6 months after she left the state, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line, just her name in the signature at the bottom, like a test. She wrote that she'd started therapy, that she finally understood why she did what she did, that she wasn't asking for forgiveness, just acknowledgement. She said she hoped I was happy. She said she missed the kids. She said she missed me. I deleted it without replying. Not because it didn't affect me. It did. It stirred something old and heavy, like a bruise you forget about until you press it. But reopening contact wouldn't have been kindness. It would have been confusion. For me. For the kids. For the fragile order I'd rebuilt piece by piece. Mark's name came up one last time through a former coworker. He'd taken a short-term contract in another state. Low responsibility. No authority. Someone mentioned he kept to himself now. Didn't drink. Didn't stay late. Didn't trust anyone. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. Just confirmation. Consequences don't need an audience. The kids stopped asking when things would go back to normal. Normal had redefined itself quietly. New routines replaced old ones without announcement. Soccer games where I stood alone on the sidelines. School plays where I clapped loud enough for two. Conversations at dinner that didn't end in tension or excuses. They laughed more. Slept better. That told me everything I needed to know. I started saying no more often. No to extra work that would pull me away for days. No to people who treated loyalty like a suggestion. No to relationships that demanded trust without offering proof. I didn't become bitter. I became selective. There's a difference, even if people confuse the two. One night, almost a year after everything fell apart, I sat in the same kitchen where I'd first noticed that unfamiliar mug. The counter was clear now. No foreign objects. No signs of intrusion. I poured myself a drink and didn't feel the need to numb anything. That felt like progress. I thought about how easily my life had been split in two, before and after, and how close I'd come to losing more than a marriage. Losing myself. Losing my kids. Losing control to rage instead of reason. The line between justice and destruction is thinner than people admit. I walked it carefully. On purpose. I don't tell this story to be admired. I tell it because betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's polite. Sometimes it smiles at you across the table and asks you to pass the salt. And revenge isn't always violent. Sometimes it's simply stepping aside and letting people collapse under the weight of their own choices. I didn't win. I survived intact. And in the end, that mattered more than any apology that came too late or any punishment I didn't have to deliver myself. The last thing Emily ever said to me in person was that she never thought I'd leave her like that. She was wrong. I didn't leave. I just stopped standing in the way of the truth. And once the truth has space to move, it finishes the job on its own. The silence that followed felt permanent, but it wasn't empty. It was loaded. Every quiet morning, every routine drive, every night when the kids were asleep and the house settled into its bones, something was still moving underneath. Not pain, not anger, awareness. People assume the story ends when the damage stops spreading. They're wrong. That's when the reckoning actually begins. A year and a half after the divorce, I ran into Emily by accident. It wasn't dramatic. No slow motion. No music. Just a grocery store on a Tuesday evening. Fluorescent lights. A cart with a squeaky wheel. I saw her reflection first in the freezer glass before I saw her directly, and my body reacted before my mind did. A tightening in the chest. A brief spike of heat behind the eyes. Then nothing. She looked smaller. Not physically. Structurally. Like someone who'd been carrying something too heavy for too long and hadn't figured out how to put it down. Her hair was darker now. Her clothes simpler. No confidence in the way she stood. When our eyes met, she froze. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she smiled. It wasn't fake. That was the worst part. It was tired and hopeful and unsure all at once. Like she was bracing for rejection, but still reaching for something familiar. I didn't smile back. I didn't frown either. I nodded. The way you do to a stranger you recognize, but don't know anymore. She said my name. Hearing it from her mouth again didn't hurt. It didn't feel good. It felt final. Like a word that had completed its purpose and no longer applied to me. She asked how the kids were. I told her they were good. She asked if I was seeing anyone. I said no. She paused, like she was waiting for me to ask the same. I didn't. There was a stretch of silence long enough to make her uncomfortable. She started talking too fast. About work. About therapy. About how she was trying to be better. The words stacked on top of each other like she was afraid if she stopped, I'd disappear. I let her talk. Not because I cared about the details, but because I wanted to see something. I wanted to see if she'd take responsibility without being prompted. Eventually, she did. She said she'd ruined everything. Said she hadn't understood what loyalty actually cost until she no longer had it. Said losing the kids the way she had almost broke her. She didn't cry. Her voice shook, but she held it together. That was new. I believed she was sorry. That didn't change anything. I told her I hoped she stayed healthy. That I hoped she figured out what she was looking for before it destroyed something else. I told her the kids were safe and loved, and that they didn't need confusion right now. I told her I wasn't angry anymore. That last part hit her the hardest. She asked if that meant there was a chance someday. I shook my head. Not cruelly. Not gently either. Just honestly. No, I said. That version of me doesn't exist anymore. She nodded like she expected that answer, but had needed to hear it anyway. We stood there for another second, surrounded by frozen dinners and low background music, two people who used to share a life reduced to polite closure. When I walked away, my hands weren't shaking. That's how I knew I was done. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I sat on the porch and thought about how close I'd come to letting bitterness define me. How easy it would have been to stay angry, to measure my recovery by how badly others suffered. But anger is loud and sloppy. Control is quiet. Control lasts. Emily would carry what she'd done forever. Mark too, wherever he ended up. Not because I punished them, but because people who betray their own foundations never fully trust the ground again. That's the real sentence. I didn't need revenge anymore. What I had was something stronger. Clarity. And once you have that, there's no going back to the dark pretending you don't see what's right in front of you. By the time 2 years had passed, the town had forgotten most of the details, but not the pattern. People who'd watched it unfold didn't gossip anymore. They quietly took notes in their minds about trust, about boundaries, about how far someone could fall when they chose selfishness over commitment. That was a kind of justice I didn't have to deliver. It delivered itself. I focused on the kids, on work, on building routines that no betrayal could shake. Weekends became sacred. I coached Little League, helped with homework, read stories at night. The kind of small moments that feel invisible but become the foundation for everything. I didn't feel a need to explain, justify, or revisit the past. I simply moved through life with precision, like a man who had been tested and had survived. Emily's attempts to reach out became sporadic. Emails, occasional texts, social media messages. I read none of them. If someone wants back in your life after all they've done, it's not my obligation to entertain the notion. They carry the weight of their choices themselves, and she was learning that every time she sent a message that went unanswered. Mark disappeared entirely. No news, no calls, no social media footprints. I suspect he started over somewhere far enough away to not trigger memories. That's what betrayal does to people like him. It forces exile. I didn't need to orchestrate it. It happened naturally. The law, the company, and their own carelessness had done the work for me. I simply observed, cataloged, and learned. One night, months later, I sat with the kids on the porch, stars spilling across the sky, and thought about how fragile trust is. How easily it can be taken for granted. How much damage can come from one wrong step. And yet, I also realized how resilient it can be when tended carefully. Every laugh, every shared moment, every lesson I gave them about honesty was a brick in a wall stronger than anything betrayal could breach. I remembered Emily's final words to me in the grocery store. How she had reached, even briefly, for what we once had. She hadn't understood that by the time she spoke, I wasn't there. The man who had loved without question, who had trusted blindly, who had believed in a shared future, no longer existed. That man had been replaced by someone who saw clearly, who acted deliberately, who didn't need closure from those who had destroyed it for themselves. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. Not revenge. Not triumph. It was precision. Calm, measured, irreversible. A state of being that can't be bargained with, that doesn't require applause or recognition. I had set the boundary, let the law run its course, and removed the manipulators from my orbit. That was enough. And yet, even in clarity, Even in control, there was still vigilance. The kind that keeps you aware. That watches for new patterns, new betrayals, new threats. Because the world doesn't wait for anyone to recover. It tests everyone relentlessly. I had learned to be ready. There was a subtle power in that, more satisfying than anger or vindication. A quiet strength that no apology could undo, no regret could diminish, no manipulation could undermine. It was final, but not loud. It was controlled, but not cold. It was the kind of justice that survives long after everyone else has moved on. And that night, as the wind whispered through the trees and the kids' laughter echoed in the yard, I realized the last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. I was no longer living in reaction to betrayal. I was living in the consequences of clarity. But just as I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet wash over me, a thought hit, the kind that raises the hair on the back of your neck. Even when you've survived, even when you've controlled everything, life has a way of testing the edges you think are safe. And sometimes, the next move comes from the place you least expect. I didn't know it yet, but that next move was coming. The house felt alive again, not because it had changed, but because I had. Every creak in the floor, every sigh of the walls, every soft breath of the kids as they slept reminded me that the chaos no longer dictated the rhythm of our lives. I had learned how to move through a storm without being swept away. Mark never called again. I don't know where he ended up, and I stopped caring the moment he stopped being a threat. Emily didn't try to reach out either, not after that last grocery store encounter. The truth had settled between us like dust in a sunbeam. Visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore, but harmless if you just let it be. I rebuilt slowly. Weekends became predictable. Homework routines, dinner at the same time, bedtime stories with no interruptions. My world was no longer contingent on the whims of deceit. Every small victory, the kids laughing without worry, a quiet house at night, a day when I didn't think about betrayal at all, added weight to my freedom. I realized revenge isn't about hurting someone else. It's about reclaiming yourself. About standing in your own skin without flinching. Every legal document, every surveillance log, every silent moment watching the consequences unfold had been part of that reclamation. I didn't feel pride. I felt justice. Not the kind handed down in courtrooms, but the kind you carve out yourself with patience, precision, and restraint. Months later, I went through the storage unit where Emily's things had been kept. I touched a few items, nothing personal, just the evidence of a life that wasn't mine anymore. I let them go one by one. The act wasn't vindictive. It was necessary. A final acknowledgement that the past couldn't touch me. I watched the kids grow, knew their lives weren't broken by betrayal. They learned love in its purest form, consistency, honesty, and accountability. I was there for them, fully, completely, without distraction. And that presence became its own form of revenge against the chaos Emily and Mark had tried to impose. A silent assertion that the foundation I built with them could not be shaken. Late at night, sometimes I think about Emily and Mark. Not with rage, not with longing, just as a reminder of the distance I've traveled, of the control I regained, of the life I refused to surrender. They are ghosts now, shadows of what could have been, and that knowledge is quiet but absolute. I've come to understand the power of calm, the power of strategy, the power of knowing when to act and when to wait. Betrayal will always sting, but the stinger loses its effect when you stop reacting and start observing. When you turn the tide with patience and precision, the destruction unfolds on its own. I didn't seek revenge for me anymore. I sought it for my life, for the children, for the peace that had been stolen. And in the end, justice arrived. Not flashy, not dramatic, not headline-making. Just steady, inevitable, and complete. The world kept turning. The house stayed full of laughter. The kids thrived. I thrived. And I learned that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with anger or fury. They're fought with clarity, patience, and the relentless commitment to never let betrayal define you. I survived. I rebuilt. And I finally understood that the life worth living isn't the one that's safe. It's the one you reclaim after everyone else thought they had taken it from you. I am here, whole, unbroken, and nothing they did, or could do, can ever change that.